The Supreme Court just made a decision on a major case involving Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act, and I want to break down exactly what happened and where this case is headed next. But before we get into all of that, I'd really appreciate it if you could do me a quick favor. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button. Also, make sure to check that YouTube hasn't randomly unsubscribed you, because that happens more often than you'd think. And while you're at it, click that notification bell and select all notifications. This really helps make sure YouTube actually shows you these videos when they come out, and it also helps the channel grow by telling the algorithm that you're into this kind of Second Amendment content. So let's get into what we're here to talk about. This is a major case involving a Second Amendment Preservation Act, sometimes called a SOPA law, and it was seeking emergency review from the Supreme Court. We've actually covered this case before because the Supreme Court previously issued an 8-1 order that denied a stay, which would have kept Missouri's SOPA law protected. Well, this case made its way back to the Supreme Court, and we just got their latest order and decision. In today's order list, the Supreme Court denied emergency review to this case once again. But here's the thing, this case is definitely not over, and there are actually some positive developments that came out of this denial. You might recall that in this case, the Trump administration kept arguing that the SOPA law is invalid in certain situations and that the Supreme Court shouldn't take up the case. But at the same time, they also told the Supreme Court that if they denied review and the case went back to the district court, the federal government would drop some of the judgments they had won previously. Missouri responded by pointing out that these concessions from the Trump DOJ are exactly why the Supreme Court should deny review. This case went to Supreme Court conference on September 29th, and this past Monday, we got the order list showing they denied emergency review. Like I said, the case is still going forward and will be sent back down to the district court. The United States government said they're going to concede and give up some of the judgment that the Biden ATF and Biden DOJ had secured earlier in this case. Let me give you some background if you're not familiar with this situation. This whole lawsuit centers around a 2021 Second Amendment Preservation Act that Missouri passed. That law laid out how the state interprets the Second Amendment and put restrictions on how much support and funding the state would give to federal agencies trying to enforce federal laws that the state believes violate the Second Amendment. The law stops Missouri officers, agents, and government officials from assisting federal agents who are trying to enforce those laws. The law also created a way for citizens to sue any Missouri official who helped enforce a federal law that the state thinks violates the Second Amendment. Basically, the law was designed to put the real enforcement power in the hands of residents rather than the state and its officers and agents. In this Missouri case, the district court looked at everything and ruled in favor of what was then the Biden administration, striking down Missouri's SOPA law completely with a full preliminary injunction. Essentially, it was a universal preliminary injunction. Missouri responded by appealing to the Eighth Circuit. At that point, Missouri wanted a temporary stay on that lower court decision, which eventually led to this case seeking emergency intervention from the Supreme Court. But when they reviewed it, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying that emergency request for a stay. Only Justice Thomas voted in favor of granting that stay. After the Supreme Court denied the case, it went back down to the Eighth Circuit for a ruling on that preliminary injunction, which led to expedited arguments. But the Eighth Circuit ultimately ruled in favor of the Biden administration again, striking down the SOPA law entirely. Then, like I mentioned, Missouri responded again by filing a petition to the Supreme Court. However, I should mention it was still on an emergency basis and still dealing with an interlocutory issue. Basically, there was no final ruling on this case yet, but once again, it ended up at the Supreme Court. One of the major points Missouri brought up is that the Eighth Circuit basically said the structure and potential operation of this law is valid, but they still struck it down because of its underlying Second Amendment purpose. Missouri argued that the Eighth Circuit ignored clear precedent and decided that state officials could be sued because the court thought the state was involved in enforcement just by following the state law. In other words, the Eighth Circuit found that compliance and not taking action was actually enforcement. This law was originally fought against by the Biden administration, but as we all know, the Trump administration is now in charge. At first, they delayed responding for several months at the Supreme Court level. Eventually, we did get a response from the Trump administration after the Second Amendment Task Force, I believe, took over this case. And still, the Trump administration kept arguing that the SOPA law is invalid and that the lower courts made the right decision. However, at the same time, they argued that if the Supreme Court denied review and the case went back to the district court, the federal government would ultimately dismiss some of the judgment that the Biden administration had won previously. The Trump DOJ argued that the judgment was too broad, too comprehensive, just overreaching in terms of what it gave the federal government. And they said they would release some of that judgment. On today's order list, the Supreme Court denied emergency review to the SOPA challenge. But despite that denial, this case isn't finished yet and will still move forward. As the United States stated in their request for denial at the Supreme Court, once this gets back to the lower court, they'll be dropping the total injunction that was issued by the district court. Missouri and its SOPA law may still be able to be put into action in some ways because this is still a pre-enforcement type of situation. It hasn't fully gone into effect yet, and they're not really certain how this works in practice. So there might be a path where SOPA and this law get to be implemented, and then the federal government and the state will kind of see how things play out. The lower court will also have to see how this actually operates once it's enforced. So there may be some ways that the SOPA law will get implemented as this case continues at the lower court level. Even though the Supreme Court denied emergency review, the case will still continue in the lower court, and the United States government will be dropping some of the judgment. We'll see what position they ultimately take at the lower court level, and if this gets elevated once again to the Eighth Circuit, what they're going to say once this is fully implemented in some ways, and once this actually gets put in place. What does that look like, and what kind of judgment will those courts issue? So, unfortunately, the Supreme Court once again denied review and denied emergency review to this case and refused to get involved at this time. But there's still hope and positive movement toward keeping Missouri's SOPA law in place in some ways and seeing how this is actually enforced. Maybe there doesn't need to be a total injunction on the entire SOPA law like the lower court gave to the Biden administration. The Trump administration is saying, okay, let's drop some of that. Let's see maybe how this gets implemented in some ways. What does this really look like? And then we'll go from there. So that seems to be what's going to happen now. We're going to see whether the United States government keeps their promise once this gets back to the lower court. That's going to be the big question. What happens now that the Supreme Court has denied this and it's being kicked back down to the district court? Will the Trump administration and the U.S. government stay true to those promises? As this develops more and as this unfolds more, I'll keep you guys updated. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by rights and reloads, and this nation will be maintained by rights and reloads.